Hey everybody, this is my first reading of Castoriadis and Critical Theory, Crisis, Critique, and Radical Alternatives by Christos Memos. What year was this published? 2014. Let's see. It's the introduction. Reading Castoriadis politically. In the crisis-ridden contemporary world, the prevailing theoretical, political, social, economic, and cultural paradigms have been called into question. Deriving from long-standing accumulated contradictions of modern societies, the multilateral crisis has given rise to a growing social dissatisfaction which has been expressed through protest, riots, and uprisings. The emerging social struggles all over the world are indicative not only of the exhaustion of the neoliberal project, they have also disclosed the inability of the left to provide a radical alternative. It appears that traditional left modes of thought and practice constitute part of the general crisis. Most importantly, they prolong and perpetuate the current crisis while at the same time acting in a manner that blocks the configuration of radical alternative solutions. Thus the question remains urgent and vital. Why are we not able to escape the current world capitalist crisis, moving toward a human, free, and egalitarian society? How could the critical exposition of the preconditions of this crisis lead to the formation of a new radicalism? And above all, is there a need in general for a new radicalism? This book aims to grapple with the above questions by providing a critical reading of the social and political writings of Cornelius Castoriadis. But why him? Over the last 30 years, there has been growing interest in the thought of Castoriadis, which is expressed in both academic and political circles. In times of severe crisis, Castoriadis' thinking could act as a source of constant inspiration and motivation for critically rethinking the foundations of Western neoliberal societies. Despite the radicalism and unique significance of his thought, his ideas are mostly praised and utilized, but they have been deprived of any critical and radical meaning. What is more, the canonization of the later Castoriadis and the numerous references to his writings that have appeared in academic journals are marked by an uncritical admiration of his work without any deeper understanding of its political significance. As a result, Castoriadis' contribution to critical social and political theory has been presented only in fragments, not fully researched and kept apart from social and political reality. In an original and scholarly manner, combining philosophical and political analysis, this study intends to reassess Castoriadis' contribution to critical theory in and through his critical confrontation with both the crisis of the traditional left and the decline of Western-type neoliberal societies. In this sense, the key concepts of crisis and critique run through the book, and are related to Castoriadis' more radical philosophical and political positions with a view to formulating the answer to the inability to build a radical alternative to neoliberal capitalism. Reading Castoriadis politically means, first of all, detaching his thought from the condition of being used as part of the, quote, succession of fads, end quote, from its reduction to another of the, quote, successive waves of the ruling system's complementary ideology, end quote, exactly that which Castoriadis was explicitly and fiercely opposed to. Reinstating Castoriadis to his actual political substance implies separating his critical theory from the dominant tendency of becoming, quote, fashionable, and involves critically confronting the, quote, compilation, misappropriation, and distortion, end quote, of his own ideas. Giving back to Castoriadis' work its proper radical problematic would amount to disengaging it from the idolatry of words, the construction of a new jargon. As Castoriadis would say, the, quote, magic of words is thus used to make the reality of things, quote, the reality of things disappear, end quote. Even after the severe financial crisis of 2008, the quote, fashionable, end quote, abstract, philosophical, and apolitical readings of Castoriadis appear to remain detached from the social and political reality. The quote, fashionable, end quote, scholars of his work resemble, as Castoriadis put it brilliantly, quote, those who discourse about the rights of man, the indeterminacy of democracy, communicative action, the self-foundation of reason, and so on, the panglosses who go on spouting their navel-watching rhetoric without ever allowing themselves to be distracted by the sound and fury of effectively actual history. End quote, Castoriadis. It seems that, as was the case with the numerous academics and intellectuals after the movements of the 1960s, the demise of the regimes in Eastern Europe provided scholars, quote, with a minimum of ideological justification, end quote, or a, quote, legitimation, end quote, both for the profound disregard of radical ideas and practices that followed the collapse, end quote, for their own incipient privatization, while also retaining some sort of, quote, radical sensibility, end quote, end quote. The philosophical writings of the later Castoriadis, as happened with specific aspects of the work of Gramsci or members of the Frankfurt School, were convenient for a, quote, retrospective legitimation of withdrawal, renunciation, non-commitment, or of a punctilious and measured commitment, end quote. Indisputably, Castoriadis threw himself open to this treatment both because of the direction and content of a large part of his later theoretical elaborations, and due to the fact that he unfortunately did very little to clarify that he aimed at a, quote, political and revolutionary, end quote, critique of totalitarianism, Marx and Marxism, which was made from a, quote, political, practical, revolutionary perspective, end quote. This is not to claim that this part of Castoriadis' work is not worthy of scholarly and analytical engagement. This is simply to argue that this does not justify the almost exclusive reading of Castoriadis' thought via these texts at the expense of the whole body of his social and political writings. Castoriadis was first and foremost a political and radical thinker, and the intended oblivion of the largest part of his work is quite undeserved and has led for the second time after the 1970s to a distorted and misleading reception of his theorizing. In many academic circles, for example, he is known, read, and used as a psychoanalyst, or his work is indissolubly connected to an abstract and indefinite account regarding concepts such as imagination, chaos, creation, monad, self, body, psyche, magma, tragedy, ensemble, identitary logic, Lejeune and Tukin, Legein and Teukhein. I don't know what those words mean. I'm not a Castoriadis expert either. In this way, Castoriadis' thought could eventually be converted into an academic discipline, canonized and kept isolated from contemporary social and political struggles. In some other instances, the attitude towards him has been a nihilistic, unqualified, and dogmatic condemnation and rejection of his thinking. This is the case with the vast majority of the Marxist or radical left treatment of Castoriadis. Having settled for decades, quote, for the role of revolutionary by proxy, end quote, quote, cuckolded and defeated as revolutionaries sans revolution, end quote. Traditional leftists and Marxists seem to perceive nothing new as they have seen and known it all before. In their own way, they open the door and they are responsible for the apolitical and conservative appropriation of Castoriadis' thought. Both of these positions cancel Castoriadis' critical and radical meaning and represent an abdication, abandonment, and concealment of the political character of his views. They ultimately neglect and bury the riches of Castoriadis's political and intellectual heritage, deferring treatment of the vital questions that he addressed. Contrary to these approaches, Castoriadis championed critical reason's historical role of, quote, provoking insubordination and destroying horrors, end quote. In contradiction to the, quote, canonized, quote, positive, quote, responsible, and, quote, constructive reading of his works, Castoriadis defended the critical function of thought and argued that the most, quote, singularly singular, end quote, creation of human history is, quote, the one that permits the society under consideration to itself call itself into question. This is the creation of the idea of autonomy, of the reflective return upon oneself, of criticism and self-criticism, of a questioning that neither knows nor accepts any limit, end quote. Diametrically opposed to the approaches that apprehend the function of scholarly work as being at the service of the established order, Castoriadis was adamant that the role of the scholar, quote, ought to be critical, end quote, and argued against a, quote, generalized pseudo-consensus, end quote, and those intellectuals who are, quote, caught up in the system, end quote. By abandoning and betraying their critical role, they, quote, become rationalizers for what is, justifiers of the established order, end quote. In this sense, he went against the grain of the academics and intellectuals who seek to catch previously marginal or subversive ideas and words, as ironically is now happening with Castoriadis' work, and make them, quote, one phenomenon among others, commercialized like the others, end quote, with a view to completing the, quote, harmony of the system, end quote. In one of his interviews in 1991, in an answer to the question of what the role of the intellectual should be, Castoriadis clarified and specified his position further, quote, uncompromising criticism of existing realities and elucidation of the possibilities for transforming them. From this vantage point, Castoriadis' meaning of critique is unfounded in a dialectical, From this vantage point, Castoriadis' meaning of, quote, critique is unfolded in a dialectical relationship with the concept of, quote, crisis, end quote. In his work, the crisis is significant for theoretical and political reasons as it reveals the contradictions that are deeply rooted in the social relations of capitalist society and pinpoints the available alternatives that point to a radical transformation of existing society. Crisis, then, is not just an economic phenomenon, a mere financial structural dysfunctionality, but it expresses the fundamental and inherent instability of capitalist social relations. The issue at stake here is not just to use Castoriadis' work to identify and describe the crisis of modern societies or the crisis of the left broadly conceived, but to understand what generates this crisis, to explore its origins. Hence the concept of, quote, crisis is understood as an open one, as a conceptualization of antagonistic and contradictory social relations that are always fluid and in motion. Crisis is articulated as a critique of, quote, existing realities, end quote, as the subversive power of struggle, negativity, and doubt. It manifests itself not only as the, quote, disruption and disorder, end quote, of riots, revolts, and uprisings, but also as elucidation of the possibilities for transforming the established order as a, quote, moment of opportunity or of necessity for acting, end quote. What is more, for Castoriadis, quote, the crisis of criticism is only one of the manifestations of the general and deep-seated crisis of society, end quote. Taken in this way, and Castoriadis' problematic concerning the relation between critique and crisis after the end of the Second World War, and in particular since 1950, quote, the Western world has entered into crisis, and this crisis consists precisely in this way, that the West ceases to call itself truly into question, end quote. This book, based upon the concepts of crisis and critique, sheds light on the largest part of Castoriadis' work, which is located within the context of radical tradition. To this end, his ideas are situated in a critical debate with other radical thinkers such as Claude Lefort, Anton Pannekoek, Hannah Arendt, Louis Althusser, Axelos. I think it's Costas Axelos. I'm not sure. Papaianu, Papaioannou, and Marx. Currently, the study offers an extensive analysis and explores the contemporary relevance of Castoriadis' views regarding the Hungarian uprising of 1956 and the events of May 1968, which have not escaped the general neglect of commentators on Castoriadis. The purpose is to elucidate, explore, and bring back to the surface Castoriadis' lost anti-authoritarianism and anti-capitalism and radicalism without neglecting the limitations, confusions, and ambiguities of his intellectual endeavor. His brilliant political analyses of social conflicts, revolts, and revolutions stand in need of being reconsidered and associated with contemporary anti-capitalist struggles. Can we understand him better than he understood himself? The book stands for a critical broadening of our understanding of Castoriadis and argues that the re-radicalization of Castoriadis' thought would amount to a reassessment of his contribution to critical theory in the light of the current world crisis. It first considers his formative experience in Greece, his distinctive migration, and political and intellectual context in post-war France, which shaped his intellectual development. The study goes on to examine his imminent critique of Marxism. From a critical confrontation with Trotsky's thought, he moved on to explicating the class nature of the USSR and analyzing the phenomenon of totalitarianism, the, quote, crisis of our century, end quote, according to Hannah Arendt. Castoriadis expressed the crisis of totalitarianism and the demise of the social regimes in Eastern Europe in his own eloquent way. Quote, there was this huge event that is the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism. Can you point out to me a single person among the politicians, not to mention the political wheeler-dealers, bracket, politicards, end bracket, on the left, who would have truly reflected on what happened, and on the reasons why it happened, and who, as is stupidly said, has drawn some lessons from it? And yet a development of this sort, in its initial phase, the rise of this monstrosity, totalitarianism, the Gulag, etc., and then in its collapse, merited some very in-depth reflection, as well as a conclusion, about what a movement aimed at changing society can do, is not to do, and cannot do. No reflection at all. Sorry. Castoriadis is dealing with the issue of the Soviet bureaucracy and the phenomenon of totalitarianism led him to a critique of Lenin's and Trotsky's ideas. Given this line of analysis, and after shedding light on his largely neglected correspondence with Anton Pannekoek on the issue of the Russian Revolution, the book explores Castoriadis' analysis of the crisis of Marxism. It focuses in particular on the events of Hungary in 1956, along with the respective analysis of Hannah Arendt, as well as on his attack against Althusser's attempt to interpret the decline of the Marxist current. In the context of the ongoing disputes about the crisis of Marxism, however, Castoriadis moved on from a critique of Marxism to a critique of Marx. Indeed, he considered Marx's particular ideas responsible for the crisis of Marxism and the labor movement more generally. Castoriadis' critique is situated as part of a broader critique of Marx developed by two other Greek thinkers who had a close affinity with his work, Costas Axelos and Costas Papaianu. Let me see how that's pronounced, because I'm going to be saying that name a lot.
Κώστας Παπαϊωάννου. Κώστας Παπαϊωάννου. Κώστας Παπαϊωάννου.
Papaianu.
Κώστας Παπαϊωάννου.
Papaianu. Yeah, Papaianu. Okay, that seems like Papaianu. Papaianu. Building on this critique, the book discusses Castoriadis' critical confrontation with the crisis and decay of Western neoliberal societies, positing as a starting point his analysis of the revolutionary crisis of May 1968. The study expands on his critical confrontation with the crisis of modern societies. Finally, and with the aim of reinvigorating the radical tradition, the book critically assesses Castoriadis' contribution to the struggles to overcome the crisis, the existing possibilities for the revival of emancipatory politics and the creation of a self-instituting and self-governing society. It concludes by offering an evaluation of Castoriadis' limits, legacy, and contribution to critical political thought. End of the introduction to Castoriadis and Critical Theory by Christos Memos.